Imagine leaving your family, your home, even your childhood pet, all at just 14 years old. Now imagine arriving in a foreign land where you're mocked, judged, and stripped of your identity. This was Marie Antoinette's reality. But that was only the beginning. What would break her spirit next? Marie Antoinette of Austria. Even her name became synonymous with excess. But when she was just 14 years old, she wasn't much more than a nervous child. You'd be nervous too. Imagine being told you're leaving your home, the grand palaces of Vienna, for a foreign court in France. Not for a visit, not for a shift in scenery, but forever. Oh, and you're doing that to marry a boy you've never met, whose language you barely speak, and whose people might not even like you. This wasn't some fairy tale wedding. It was a political move cooked up and signed off by powerful men in powdered wigs. Marie wasn't just a bride. She was a pawn in a treaty, meant to cement an alliance between Austria and France, and she knew it. Her trip to France wasn't exactly a quick goodbye and a quick hello. The journey stretched on for weeks, slowly unraveling the world as she knew it. It all ended in an oddly sterile ritual at the border between the two nations. There, a ceremony stripped her of every trace of her Austrian identity. Everything Austrian she had brought with her was taken away. Her dresses, her jewelry, even the loyal little dog she thought might be her companion through this. Instead, she was dressed head to toe in French silk and lace, wrapped up like a delicate package, and handed over to a court that would become her new prison. To them, she was no longer Archduchess Maria Antonia of Austria. She was Marie Antoinette, Dauphine of France. Of course, stripping someone of their belongings is far easier than stripping them of their spirit, or in Marie's case, her vulnerabilities. Once at Versailles, she was expected to be the picture of poise, but she was only a teenager. A shy, politically inexperienced teenager with a thick Austrian accent and a look of uncertainty that must have screamed easy pickings to the older, sharper courtiers around her. The French court at Versailles wasn't just a beautiful palace full of glamorous nobles. It was a nest of vipers. Whispers of gossip travelled faster than footsteps, and even a slightly awkward curtsy could set tongues wagging. Imagine learning to navigate that as a foreigner with no friends, no family, and no way to escape. It didn't take long for her differences to alienate the people around her. Austrians were already unpopular in France, too rich, too arrogant, too other. And then here comes this girl, plucked straight from Austrian royalty, expected to embrace the French people like a queen, while teenagers her age back home were probably scribbling poems in journals or making up excuses to skip lessons. Every laugh she gave, every glance, every stumble, was scrutinized and criticized, as if her nervous smile, or lack of it, was a revelation of national betrayal. If her very presence wasn't enough to ruffle feathers, her youth and lack of experience were easy ammunition, especially in a court where appearing poised wasn't just encouraged, it was the standard. Behind closed doors, things hardly grew warmer for the Dauphine. For one, her new husband, Louis Auguste, the Dauphin of France, turned out to be as shy and awkward as she was. Historians have described him as far more interested in locks, keys, and hunting than in courtly affairs, or his teenage bride. He reportedly avoided her at times, creating an unexpected obstacle to fulfilling what was, arguably, her primary duty, to produce an heir. Imagine being 14, shuffled into a royal marriage, and then blamed when things didn't unfold as expected. The whispers among courtiers grew louder. Some mocked her for not being refined or sophisticated enough to capture her husband's attention, while others outright called her a failure at her most basic role. The isolation didn't stop there. Public resentment of the young foreign Dauphine spilled beyond Versailles and leaked into the streets of Paris. To many of the French people already wary of outsiders, Marie symbolized everything they distrusted about Austria's influence. She was painted as frivolous, immature, and incapable of embracing French traditions. Of course, it didn't help that she found solace in spending, ordering elaborate gowns and hairstyles that only seemed to confirm people's opinions of her as an extravagant outsider. However, it wasn't as much vanity as it was survival. Clothes and appearances were, in many ways, Marie's armor. If the court could see her weakness in so many other ways, at least she could look untouchable. But that didn't stop the critics. A particularly brutal practice of the time was the circulation of pamphlets, little booklets passed hand to hand that could spread any idea, no matter how false or crude. Some of these were simple stories of political intrigue, while others crossed into nasty personal attacks. It wasn't long before Marie Antoinette became a favorite target. She was caricatured as a spoiled, meddlesome brat who drained French resources and had no respect for the people she was meant to serve. And yes, these were the impressions forming long before she actually ascended to the throne. It's almost hard to blame a teenage girl for wanting to escape through lavish balls and private gatherings when the alternative was relentless scrutiny. Looking back, you'd be forgiven for wondering if she ever had a chance. Even unconsciously, the French public and government seemed poised to reject her, not necessarily as a person, but as a symbol. To them, she wasn't Marie Antoinette, the sometimes shy, sometimes naive girl trying to fit into a court, saturated with danger. She was Marie Antoinette, the Austrian, the foreign princess, the political tool. It's a label that left her out of place in both worlds, distrusted by France and far from the place she once called home. And yet, those years as the misunderstood Dauphine would be nothing compared to what awaited her as queen. If her youth drew criticism early on, her reign would amplify the lightning rod she had already become. After all, being Queen of France didn't come with a manual or any sympathy. Becoming Queen of France was supposed to be the crowning achievement of Marie Antoinette's life. But from the moment that crown touched her head, it came with expectations so intense, they almost seemed designed to crush her. Everything boiled down to one thing: an heir. Producing a healthy boy to continue the Bourbon dynasty wasn't just her most important role, it was practically her only one, as far as the court and the country were concerned. Forget diplomacy, forget charity, forget personal happiness. Marie's entire value to France hung on her ability to deliver a king-to-be. But as months turned to years with no heir in sight, disappointment quietly fermented into hostility. The people grew restless, the court grew impatient, and Marie, well, she found herself at the center of a very public and very personal storm. To really understand the pressure placed on Louis and Marie, you have to picture the political stakes. France's monarchy rested on a tradition called primogeniture, the idea that power passed from father to eldest son. Without a son, the entire system seemed vulnerable, and while heirs had plenty of value politically, they also carried practical benefits. A baby boy symbolized strength, stability, a reassurance to the people that everything would remain predictably in line. So when those expectations weren't met, people started asking questions. Whispers turned into rumors, and before long, questions of, why hasn't the Queen had a child, became accusations. Why is the Queen failing to have a child? Now the simple truth was that Marie was young, just 18 when she became queen, and her marriage to Louis wasn't exactly the passionate whirlwind people might imagine. By all accounts, Louis was shy, awkward, and not particularly attentive to his new wife. Their relationship could be described as distant at best, and for reasons historians still debate, their marriage remained unconsummated for several years. Some suggest physical complications on Louis's part. Others point to a lack of experience or, frankly, nervousness on both sides. Whatever the cause, no physical relationship meant no heirs, and no heirs meant Marie's position and reputation became shakier with each passing year. But let's not forget how public this problem was. Today, fertility struggles are handled, ideally, with privacy and empathy. For Marie Antoinette, there was no privacy. Her marriage, her bedroom, her body, they were essentially public property. Courtiers speculated endlessly about what might be wrong. Was it her fault? Was Louis at fault? Was there some deeper, darker conspiracy at play? This wasn't the kind of gossip whispered discreetly behind fans. It was loud, invasive, and often cruel. Gossip pamphlets, those slim, hand-printed tabloids we mentioned earlier, circulated widely, pointing incessantly at the Queen's supposed failures. And because she was a foreigner, many people assumed, almost by default, that the problem must lie with her. She became an easy scapegoat in a culture where women's worth was so closely tied to their ability to bear children. Marie didn't exactly win herself sympathy, though it's fair to say she wasn't handed the tools to succeed either. Instead of directly addressing the mounting criticism, she distracted herself with the pleasures of court life. Lavish gowns, elaborate hairstyles, extravagant parties, these things became her escape. It was hardly surprising, given how isolating her position had become. But it also didn't do her reputation any favors. From the outside, it looked like the Queen cared more about diamonds and dances than doing her duty to France. The reality of her frustration, that remained hidden behind corsets and silk, transformed into something the public could all too easily mock. Of course, the lack of an heir didn't stay a topic confined to the palace. Whether or not it should have been anyone's business, people made it their business. Parisian crowds would grumble about their queen, blaming her for infertility as if it were a choice. Political pamphlets weren't shy in painting her as frivolous, selfish, even unnatural. And when that wasn't enough, they leaned on caricature. Marie was portrayed as an Austrian outsider plotting against France, a seductress incapable of commanding her husband's attention, or worse, simply a weak and useless woman. The unfairness of this isn't hard to see today, but in 18th century France, this kind of public opinion could destroy you, and for Marie, it nearly did. Even within Versailles, the scrutiny was relentless. Court life revolved around appearances and protocols, with her every move subjected to judgment. Conversations were dissected for hidden meaning. A single misstep, an improper greeting, an unfamiliar French custom, could ripple through the tightly woven network of aristocrats, reinforcing the idea that Marie wasn't up to the task. Underneath all the gowns and powdered wigs, there was a brutal game being played, and Marie, young and inexperienced, often stumbled across the board. She became the constant topic of speculation, both as a queen and as a woman. Without realizing it, her very existence turned into a spectacle, despite any efforts to rise above it. To make matters even thornier, gossip about her relationship with Louis only fueled tensions. People couldn't resist dissecting why the couple seemed distant and awkward, and rumors of possible dalliances outside the marriage soon followed. Some whispered about supposed affairs, painting Marie as unfaithful or even unscrupulous, though these claims lacked proof. Others painted Louis as inattentive or indifferent to his wife's struggles. The truth. Historians suggest that both partners were simply ill-prepared for the weight of their roles. They may have lacked the closeness or communication needed to present a united front, a problem that widened the gap between them and the increasingly impatient public. When Marie finally did give birth to her first child, a daughter named Marie-Thérèse, in 1778, you'd think it might have been a moment of relief, right? A chance to quiet the critics. Well, not exactly. A daughter, though cherished by the Queen, simply wasn't what people wanted. They needed a boy to cement the succession. One observer at the time noted quite dryly that crowds in Paris celebrated when the baby was born, only to fall silent once word spread it was a girl. Marie's joy in becoming a mother barely registered against France's disappointment. It wasn't until 1781, nearly 7 years after her marriage, that Marie finally gave birth to a son. Louis Joseph, the long-awaited Dauphin. It was a victory, no doubt, but for Marie, the celebration came with exhaustion. By then, years of pressure and criticism had taken their toll. Even as the court congratulated her, Marie must have known that every success she achieved would only shift the goalposts. A son may have quieted some gossip, but it couldn't erase the lingering resentment people already felt toward her. And the whispers that once floated through Versailles weren't so easily silenced. What stands out most in all of this is how the lack of an heir wasn't just a family issue. It was treated like a national crisis. The frustration, impatience, and outright anger directed at Marie became a mirror of a much larger dissatisfaction. France was already struggling economically, socially, and politically, and Marie, unfairly or not, became a convenient outlet for that frustration. Her body, her choices, even her supposed failures. Everything about her became a focus point for collective discontent. The public didn't just want answers, they wanted someone to blame. Over time, that blame turned into something far uglier: hatred. The extravagant dresses and parties that once seemed like her escape turned into symbols of the very things people felt were wrong with the monarchy. It didn't matter if she was simply a product of her environment, an Austrian teenager thrust into impossible expectations. To the court and to the nation, she had become a villain, all while sitting at the heart of the very system those same people once revered. The strain of being under such intense scrutiny, combined with her early years of isolation, forced Marie into survival mode. Unfortunately, survival for her meant reshaping herself in ways that only seemed to confirm her critics' narratives. And that was the real tragedy. Her efforts to cope with the relentless pressure ended up feeding the resentment that had already taken root. From questioned fertility to whispered scandals, Marie's very existence at court became a story of impossible expectations piling on top of each other. Of course, we can sit here and say, with hindsight, how unfair it all was. A young woman blamed for biology, held responsible for matters far outside her control. But hindsight wouldn't save Marie. The seeds of resentment planted early in her reign were about to grow into something worse. Public frustration with her, and with the monarchy as a whole, would soon turn into open rebellion. And in the midst of all that chaos, Marie wouldn't just be a queen under scrutiny. She'd become a scapegoat. How does a teenage girl, born into one of the most opulent courts in Europe, come to represent an entire nation's financial ruin? That's the question at the heart of Marie Antoinette's image as Madame Deficit. It's important to start by saying France's financial crisis wasn't a new problem in her time. By the late 18th century, the country was buried under debts that had been piling up for generations. Wars, royal extravagance, and a deeply flawed taxation system had left the government scrambling to fill its coffers. But the people didn't care much for spreadsheets or policy details. They wanted a villain, and they found one in their queen. Let's back up a bit. Life in France had always revolved around inequality. The wealthy nobility and clergy paid little to no taxes, while the lower classes bore the brunt of national expenses. Throw in poor harvests, bread shortages, and rising unemployment, and you had the perfect conditions for public anger. Unfortunately for Marie Antoinette, she came to the throne at exactly the wrong moment. France's economy was fraying at the seams, and the monarchy, already viewed as out of touch, provided an irresistible target, and Marie's lifestyle, whether exaggerated or not, turned her into Exhibit A. Marie wasn't the first queen to enjoy expensive fashions or jewels, far from it. French queens before her were no strangers to opulence, and Versailles itself was purpose-built to display the monarchy's wealth. But when economic tensions hit a breaking point, the public's tolerance for royal excess dwindled fast. Timing is everything, and Marie's taste became symbolic of everything wrong with the system. Her preference for costly gowns, towering hairstyles, and custom-designed furnishings seemed especially egregious when juxtaposed with images of Parisian breadlines. The disconnect between her glittering world at Versailles and the harsh realities of the average French citizen's life created fertile ground for resentment. The nickname Madame Deficit was born out of this resentment. It didn't matter that France's financial problems had little to do with Marie personally. What mattered was the perception of her as a reckless spender. Critics directed their rage at things like the Petit Trianon, a private estate Marie famously redesigned for herself. This sprawling retreat, with its gardens and mock village, became a symbol of her supposed disregard for the country's struggles. To the starving peasants, it wasn't just a playground for a bored queen. It was proof that the monarchy had its priorities all wrong. The thing is, the idea of Marie Antoinette single-handedly causing France's financial troubles is laughable when you look at the numbers. Most of the national debt came from wars. France had spent massive amounts supporting the American Revolution, a decision that won them little besides a shared hatred of the British. Then, there were the ongoing costs of maintaining Versailles, funding the military, and paying off debts inherited from previous reigns. But none of these issues had the same emotional weight as the image of a queen dripping with diamonds and flitting between balls. In the public's eyes, she was emblematic of everything bloated and corrupt about the monarchy. Now, were her spending habits exaggerated? Absolutely. Some accounts lean more into fiction than fact. Those infamous multi-tiered wigs. While she did enjoy elaborate hairstyles, only the most extreme examples were true, and they were often created for specific occasions rather than daily life. Tales of her excess were broadened and twisted by propaganda, much of it designed to stoke public outrage. Pamphlets printed in Paris depicted her in vulgar cartoons, often alongside crude captions accusing her of bleeding the treasury dry. It wasn't just her extravagance people targeted. It was her morality, her intelligence, even her loyalty to France. As an Austrian-born queen, she was an outsider from the start, and she never fully escaped the suspicion that came with it. One story that sticks out is the so-called milkmaid fantasy. Supposedly, at her Petit Trianon, Marie enjoyed dressing up as a shepherdess and playing at rural life. Her critics used this story as an example of her frivolity, judging her for pretending to understand the lives of peasants while living in unimaginable comfort. The truth, she did build a fake farm, complete with a dairy, but its purpose was more about creating a picturesque escape from court life than mocking the working class. But in the hands of her enemies, this small eccentricity became ammunition. To those struggling to feed their children, the image of Marie pouring fresh milk into porcelain dishes probably felt like a personal insult. Beyond the propaganda, there's a more practical reason why Marie became such a convenient target. Women in power rarely escape scrutiny. Queens, more than kings, are subjected to intense criticism for their behaviors, appearances, and supposed influence over their husbands. Louis XVI, though king, largely avoided the personal attacks that dominated conversations about Marie. If anything, people thought him too dull to inspire much anger. Marie, with her charm, style, and strong friendships, was more captivating and easier to villainize. The public imagined her whispering into Louis's ear, pulling strings behind the scenes, and steering policies in self-serving directions. It didn't matter whether these ideas held any truth. What mattered was that they fit the narrative people wanted to believe. But here's the irony. As much as Marie became the face of France's collapse, she had very little political authority. Unlike queens regnant who ruled in their own right, Marie Antoinette's role was political theatre. Her job was to marry, produce heirs, and embody the grandeur of the French monarchy. Even if she had wanted to interfere with state finances, she didn't have the power to do so. Most decisions about taxation, spending, and reforms were far removed from her influence. And yet, to the public, it was easier to blame one highly visible woman than to untangle the complex web of systemic failures choking the nation. By the late 1780s, this resentment morphed into anger, then fury. As bread riots broke out in Paris, images of Marie Antoinette feasting and throwing lavish parties were burned into people's minds. The truth of whether she actually said the infamous phrase, "let them eat cake," is irrelevant here. She didn't, by the way. It's a myth. But the fact that so many believed it speaks to how far her reputation had fallen. People wanted a figurehead for their suffering, and she fit the role perfectly. Her downfall wasn't just about her own choices, but about the human need to simplify large problems by pinning them on a single, tangible source. Marie's nickname, Madame Deficit, solidified her place in history not as a queen, but as a scapegoat. It stripped her of her humanity, reducing her to an emblem of greed. Lost in this narrative was the girl who had come to France as a teenager, forced into a world she didn't understand. The young mother who adored her children, who felt immense pride when she finally gave France its long-awaited heir. The woman who, for better or worse, coped with her stress by retreating into a world of luxury. The complexities of her life were overshadowed by the simplicity of her vilification. But if her critics thought that tearing down her image would solve France's problems, they were sorely mistaken. Even as public hatred blossomed, the true causes of the nation's financial collapse remained unaddressed. The government's inability to reform the tax system, its mounting debts from unnecessary wars, its refusal to adapt to growing calls for equality, those were the real culprits. Yet transforming an entire nation's economy was impossible without upheaval, and upheaval, as it turned out, was just around the corner. Public resentment of Marie Antoinette wasn't just a passing trend. It festered and grew, setting in motion the events that would dismantle the monarchy altogether. the stories about her didn't stop at calling her extravagant. They soon became character assassinations, paving the way for accusations far more personal and far more damaging. By the time the revolution truly ignited, Marie wasn't just a lightning rod for blame. She was a symbol of everything France wanted to destroy. What began with frustrations over spending would evolve into cruel attacks on her character, her motherhood, and her very existence. And while those earlier accusations of extravagance weren't trivial, they would seem almost quaint compared to what was coming. Imagine being accused of masterminding a scheme to steal one of the most extravagant pieces of jewelry ever created, something you've never even seen, let alone touched. That's exactly what happened to Marie Antoinette in an event so strange. It feels more like a crime novel than history. The diamond necklace affair wasn't just a scandal. It was a very public explosion that painted Marie as greedy, deceitful, and corrupt. And the worst part? She had absolutely nothing to do with it. Let's start with the necklace itself. This wasn't your everyday pearl string or ruby pendant. This thing was massive, excessive even by Versailles standards. Designed years earlier by two jewelers, Böhmer and Bassange, the necklace was originally intended for King Louis XIV's mistress, Madame du Barry. But then Louis XV died, and Madame du Barry faded into the background of court life. So now the jewelers had this absurdly expensive creation, 680 diamonds weighing over 2,800 carats, and no one to sell it to. They tried everything to offload it, but the price tag was astronomical, even by royal standards, and no one seemed willing to buy. Enter Jeanne de la Motte. If you've never heard of her, you're about to. Jeanne was a noblewoman by birth, but barely. Her family had fallen on hard times, and she'd spent most of her life clawing her way into Parisian society, using charm, lies, and sometimes outright scams. Jeanne came across the diamond necklace thanks to her circle of dubious connections and saw an opportunity. She concocted a plan so bold and convoluted, it could have been lifted straight from a con artist's playbook. Jeanne's idea: convince the jewelers that Marie Antoinette wanted to buy it. The Queen didn't, of course. She had no interest in the necklace and had reportedly rejected it years earlier when it was first offered to her. But Jeanne played on the jeweler's desperation to sell. She claimed to have unique access to Marie and even fabricated letters that appeared to be written by the Queen herself, requesting the necklace in secret. The scheme relied on a lie so audacious, it almost felt believable. After all, Marie was famous for her taste for luxury, wasn't she? That's exactly what Jeanne was counting on. The turning point in Jeanne's con came when she roped in a high-ranking dupe, Cardinal de Rohan. Cardinal de Rohan was a powerful figure in the church, but his reputation was, well, complicated. He had fallen out of favor with the Queen years earlier and was desperate to regain her goodwill. Jeanne used that desperation to her advantage, convincing him that she could help repair his relationship with Marie. And somehow, she managed to pull him into her web, not just as a pawn, but as the key player. Jeanne claimed that the Queen wanted the Cardinal to act as an intermediary in the transaction, secretly securing the necklace for her without involving the official treasury. To seal the illusion, Jeanne went to absurd lengths. She arranged a midnight meeting in the gardens of Versailles between Cardinal de Rohan and a woman pretending to be Marie Antoinette. This wasn't the real Queen, of course. It was a prostitute vaguely resembling her, dressed up to complete the illusion. In the dark, with emotions running high, the Cardinal didn't question the ruse. He walked away believing that the Queen herself had personally approved the deal, solidifying his belief that he was playing a key role in her secret request. The deal was struck. The necklace was taken on credit, arranged by the jewelers and guaranteed by Cardinal de Rohan in the Queen's name. Jeanne pocketed a massive cut from the fraud, while the necklace itself was broken apart and sold off in pieces on the black market. But it didn't take long for the whole thing to unravel. When the jewelers asked for payment, Marie Antoinette was both confused and furious. She had never wanted the necklace, let alone agreed to buy it. For a queen already swimming in public suspicion, though, the truth didn't matter. Once the story broke, the public was all too willing to believe it. And believe it they did. Headlines and pamphlets exploded with tales of the scandal, each more outlandish than the last. Even though Jeanne de la Motte and Cardinal de Rohan had orchestrated the whole scheme, Marie Antoinette became the central target of the public's outrage. After all, wasn't this exactly what they'd expected of her? A pampered queen with no regard for the suffering of her people, plotting to buy yet another bauble while the rest of France starved. Never mind that the necklace didn't even interest her. She had become so deeply embedded in the collective imagination as a symbol of greed that facts were irrelevant. The trial that followed only made things worse. Jeanne, of course, was arrested and put on trial, as was Cardinal de Rohan. But the focus of the proceedings wasn't just their guilt. It was Marie's supposed role in the whole affair. The courtroom became a theatre for public humiliation, where whispers of treason and extravagance turned into screams. Jeanne, ever the opportunist, leaned into the public hatred of the Queen, spinning her story to make Marie out as both manipulative and complicit. And because the people were so ready to believe the worst, Jeanne became almost a folk hero, while the Queen's innocence was drowned out. Even the verdict couldn't clear Marie's name. Jeanne was convicted and sentenced to public flogging and exile. But Cardinal de Rohan, arguably one of the key enablers, was acquitted. Why? His powerful connections and respectable position saved him. But in the eyes of the public, it was seen as proof that Marie had pulled strings to protect herself. The details didn't matter. In a time of powder-keg tension, when trust in the monarchy was already at a low, the idea of a scheming queen manipulating her way out of trouble made too much sense to too many people. This wasn't just a fleeting moment of bad press for Marie Antoinette. It was a turning point that cemented her reputation. The image of Madame Deficit, already so ingrained in the public psyche, now had a new layer of deceit and corruption. The necklace scandal provided the perfect narrative weapon, one that folded greed, betrayal, and monarchy-wide corruption into a single, digestible story. Never mind that the revolution was still on the horizon, or that France's larger problems went far beyond the Queen's jewelry box. For now, Marie Antoinette had become the villain everyone was searching for. For Marie personally, the fallout must have been devastating. This wasn't just about her reputation. It was about her role as wife, mother, and queen. She had already endured years of pressure to produce an heir, endless gossip about her morals, and scrutiny over her Austrian roots. The diamond necklace affair pushed all of that over the edge, turning her name into a kind of shorthand for scandal. She wasn't just unpopular anymore, she was despised. Of course, the real cost of the scandal wasn't just one woman's broken reputation. It broke any remaining trust the French people still had in their monarchy. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette went from being criticized to being outright hated, seen not as flawed, but as fundamentally unfit to rule. It didn't matter that Jeanne de la Motte had orchestrated the entire scheme, or that Marie hadn't so much as glanced at the necklace. The truth had become irrelevant in the face of collective rage. The story of the diamond necklace affair didn't just damage Marie Antoinette's life. It became a symbol of everything wrong with the monarchy. It tied her name forever to greed, manipulation, and betrayal. And for a queen whose greatest crime was being born into the wrong role at the wrong time, it was just one more nail in an already sealed coffin. By the end of it all, Marie must have felt the walls closing in. The accusations weren't going to stop. Not after this. Behind the powdered wigs and royal titles, she must have known that her family was teetering on the brink of disaster. If she didn't yet understand how dangerous her position had become, the rumors, the pamphlets, and the venomous crowds were making it clearer by the day. And as we move into the next chapter of her life, those accusations of betrayal become far more personal, taking aim not just at her character, but at her very humanity. Imagine cradling a newborn in your arms, marveling at their tiny hands, their soft sighs as they drift to sleep. Now imagine losing that child and the next, and realizing that every child you've ever loved is slipping away, some to illness, others to history's chaos. For Marie Antoinette, being a mother wasn't just a role. It was the one bond that kept her grounded as the world around her shattered. But in the end, even motherhood became a source of heartbreak she couldn't escape. Marie had 4 children, and like any mother, she adored them. Her firstborn, Marie-Thérèse, nicknamed Madame Royale, arrived in 1778. It had been a long 7 years since her marriage, and even though she wasn't the male heir everyone had been holding their breath for, the birth marked a bright moment for the Queen. Marie threw herself into raising her daughter, a hands-on approach unusual for a queen at the time. She personally oversaw her education and development, something that royal protocol would normally leave to nannies and governesses. It wasn't just about duty. Marie found genuine joy in their connection. At court, where so much of her life felt performative, her children gave her something real, something hers. In 1781, the long-awaited boy was finally born. Louis Joseph, the Dauphin of France, was hailed as a triumph, not just for the royal family, but for the monarchy itself. The pressure to produce an heir had been a weight on Marie's shoulders, and now she could finally exhale. You can almost see how the public celebrated with her, briefly anyway. Despite how tough things were becoming in France, young Louis Joseph symbolized hope for stability. But as fate would have it, this hope was short-lived. The little boy was frail from the start. As the years went on, he developed symptoms of tuberculosis, a disease that only weakened him further. Watching him struggle with breathing and persistent fevers must have been excruciating for a mother who could do nothing more than watch and wait. Marie and Louis XVI welcomed 2 more children after the Dauphin. Louis Charles in 1785, who would later be known as Louis XVII, and Sophie in 1786. Sophie was a rosy-faced baby and brought another moment of light into Marie's increasingly tumultuous life. But tragedy struck early. Sophie died before she even reached her first birthday, taken by what was most likely tuberculosis. It's said that Marie, always known at court for her composure, dissolved into tears when her daughter passed, retreating from public appearances for weeks. It wasn't just the loss of a child. It was the shattering realization that even her role as a mother, the one thing she felt she could pour her heart into, wasn't safe from life's cruelties. The death of baby Sophie had barely faded when the family faced an even greater blow. By 1789, young Louis Joseph's health had deteriorated rapidly, at just 7 years old, the Dauphin, the future of the Bourbon monarchy, died from tuberculosis, leaving behind devastated parents and a nation that took it as yet another ominous omen. Marie probably held his small hand in those final moments, not as a queen, but as a heartbroken mother, wishing for a miracle she knew wouldn't come. Imagine comforting a dying child, trying to keep your voice steady for their sake, knowing all the while that this was goodbye. For Marie, the loss of her son wasn't just a personal agony. It likely felt like yet another failure, another reason for the public to turn on her. If the deaths of Sophie and Louis Joseph tore away pieces of Marie's heart, the revolution that followed would rip out the rest. By 1789, the French Revolution was in full swing, and the royal family was no longer untouchable. Their world of silk, jewels, and banquets had been replaced by fear and uncertainty, as public anger turned into violent demands for change. When the family was taken from Versailles and imprisoned in the Tuileries Palace, they were stripped of their previous life, along with any sense of security. But for Marie, the punishment that followed didn't just target her as a queen. It targeted her as a mother. Her youngest son, Louis Charles, was now the presumptive heir after his older brother's death. But as the revolution gained momentum, his status as a child king made him a dangerous asset. Revolutionaries viewed him not as a boy, but as a potential symbol for royalist uprisings. By 1793, he was torn from Marie's arms and taken to a separate cell, his treatment growing more horrifying by the day. For a boy of just 8 years old, it was a punishment cruel beyond words. He was placed under the so-called guardianship of revolutionary jailers, who ensured he was kept utterly isolated. His days were spent trapped in a small, filthy cell, denied proper food, clothing, or human contact. Over time, the once lively child succumbed to confusion and despair, deteriorating physically and mentally in the most haunting ways. As for Marie, the loss of Louis Charles may have been the final blow. The revolutionaries ensured she was kept painfully aware of her son's suffering. Reports of his mistreatment reached her, but she was powerless to act. Her pleas for mercy went unanswered. The one small comfort she could have clung to, that her children might survive this nightmare, was stolen from her. It's hard to imagine anything more cruel than being forced to endure the helplessness of knowing your child is suffering just out of reach. The emotional torture didn't stop there. During Marie's own trial, the revolutionaries leveled an accusation so heinous, it's almost unthinkable. They accused her of incest with Louis Charles, framing him as both victim and witness. The charge had no basis in reality. It was purely designed as a final humiliation to strip Marie of any dignity she had left. Disoriented and grief-stricken, Marie rose to her own defense. "If I have not replied, it is because nature itself refuses to respond to such a charge," she told the court. "I appeal to all mothers here." In the icy silence that followed, even her most bitter enemies seemed momentarily stunned. But this was no mercy. By then, her fate had already been decided. The loss of her son was something few, if any, could survive with their spirit intact. Louis Charles's life ended in that prison, a shadow of the happy boy who once played in the gardens at Versailles. His captors allowed tuberculosis to consume him, and he passed away 2 years after his mother's execution. They buried him in an unmarked grave, leaving his legacy to fade into silence. However, for Marie, those final days locked away in her cell were endured with the knowledge of her youngest son's unimaginable suffering. Perhaps she even suspected that his fate was sealed. There's something about that level of hopelessness that defies explanation. By the time she was sent to the guillotine, she wasn't the same Marie who had arrived in France as a wide-eyed teenager. She'd lost too much. Her youngest daughter, Marie-Thérèse, survived the revolution and lived out her days in exile. But even that may have brought little comfort. Marie's losses weren't confined to motherhood. They permeated every part of her life. The weight of losing 2 children, her husband, her freedom, and her reputation became too much for one person to carry. And yet, even in her shattered state, she somehow endured. Marie Antoinette's identity as a mother is often overshadowed by the caricature history painted of her. Madame Deficit, the frivolous queen who danced while her people starved. But strip away the myths, and you begin to see a woman who loved fiercely, who found light in the laughter of her children, even as the rest of her world darkened. Her role as a mother wasn't just one part of her story. It was the part that made her most human. But in the end, even that couldn't be protected. The loss of her children was a scar she carried silently, right up to the moment she climbed those wooden steps to the guillotine. Her shattered heart and fractured family mirrored a country breaking apart piece by piece. And as France wrestled with its pain, it projected that pain onto her. Yet through all of it, every unimaginable loss, Marie Antoinette carried herself in a way that forced even her critics to pause. By the end, she had little to live for, yet everything to mourn. And though her children's laughter once filled the gilded halls of Versailles, it was the silence afterward that stayed with her. In her pain, her humanity shines through, louder than any scandal or whispered gossip ever could. This was what the revolutionaries never understood. In their quest to destroy a queen, they also destroyed a woman, a mother, a human being. But her story didn't end there. It became part of a larger tragedy, one that would echo through history as a haunting reminder of the cost of losing not only lives, but hope itself. Her children, her legacy, her life. She lost it all. And from her cell, waiting to face the blade, she was left to carry that weight alone. Imagine sitting alone in a dim, damp room with nothing but stone walls to keep you company. The air smells of mildew. The floor is cold beneath your feet. And there isn't a single echo of life outside. You're not here because of some horrible crime, but because circumstances placed a crown on your head and history turned against you. This was Marie Antoinette's final reality. Once, she walked the glowing halls of Versailles. Now she was trapped in a shadowy, claustrophobic prison cell, stripped of her title, family, freedom, and dignity. All she could do was wait and endure. Marie's imprisonment began in 1792, when the royal family was forced from the Tuileries Palace and sent to the Temple, a fortified tower in Paris. The revolution had reached a boiling point. The monarchy was abolished, and the king, Louis XVI, was on his way to trial. The Temple was no Versailles. It was dark, drafty, and isolated, the kind of place meant to send a message. There were no gilded ceilings or polished chandeliers to soften the blow, just plain stone walls and a growing sense that the world Marie once knew had vanished forever. At first, the royal family, Marie, Louis, their 2 surviving children, and the king's sister, Madame Elizabeth, were imprisoned together. Even under such dire conditions, they clung to each other, finding comfort in small routines. But as months wore on, even that shred of normalcy was stripped away. In January of 1793, Louis XVI was executed, a moment that shattered whatever resilience Marie had left. The man she'd shared decades with, The father of her children was gone, and she wasn't even allowed to mourn him properly. Shortly after, her youngest son, Louis Charles, known as the Dauphin, was taken from her. He was just 8 years old, but the revolutionaries saw him as a symbol of counter-revolutionary hopes. To re-educate him in revolutionary ideals, they isolated him, subjecting him to neglect and abuse that would eventually claim his life. For Marie, hearing about her son's plight through second-hand whispers must have been torture. She could no longer protect or comfort him, no matter how much she begged. Then, the little she had left was torn away. In August of 1793, Marie Antoinette was separated from her daughter, Marie-Thérèse, and her sister-in-law, Elisabeth. She was transferred to the Conciergerie, a grim prison known as the antechamber of the guillotine. The Conciergerie was notorious even in its time, a place where prisoners awaited trial, knowing full well what the outcome would be. It was not designed for comfort. Her cell was small, filthy, and damp, with barely enough light to see by. Revolutionaries stationed guards inside the room itself, watching her day and night. There was no privacy, not even to sleep or grieve. Everything was under surveillance, reducing a former queen to less than a prisoner. She was now a spectacle. The conditions in the Conciergerie were as inhumane as they were humiliating. Hygiene was non-existent. The air was heavy with the stench of sewage, sweat, and fear, and there was no escape from it. Rats scurried through the halls, their presence so regular they almost seemed like additional jailers. The straw mattress on the floor that Marie was forced to sleep on was infested with lice. It wasn't just physical discomfort, but a stripping away of humanity itself. Each new indignity chipped away at whatever inner strength she had left. Sleep eluded her. The guards stationed in her cell made sure of that. They stayed awake through the night, shuffling loudly, coughing, and moving deliberately to disturb her rest. Every time her breathing slowed and her body relaxed, they'd shift, ensuring she never stayed too comfortable. By morning, she was still awake, her eyes red and heavy, another sleepless night adding to the weight on her shoulders. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was a form of psychological punishment, a reminder that even her most basic needs weren't under her control anymore. Her appearance, once so carefully maintained at Versailles, became unrecognizable. Marie, famous for her extravagant dresses and towering hairstyles, now wore plain, tattered clothing. Her hair had gone grey from stress, and her skin, once pampered by royal beauty routines, was sallow and marked by the conditions of her imprisonment. If she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the bucket of water they allowed her to wash with, it must have been startling, like staring at a stranger. This was exactly what her captors wanted. They weren't content with imprisoning her body. They sought to destroy her spirit, to reduce her to an image of weakness, a far cry from the queen she once was. Marie's isolation was perhaps the hardest punishment of all. For someone who had always surrounded herself with companions, the silence of the Conciergerie must have been deafening. The absence of her children, their laughter, their cries, even their footsteps, hung around her like a heavy fog. The memory of her son, just a floor below her in his own separate hell, haunted her. If she spoke to the guards or attempted to ask about him, she was either ignored or met with cold indifference. Whatever news trickled in was meant to wound her. The enveloping loneliness left her trapped not just in a prison cell, but in her own mind. And yet, the revolutionaries were not satisfied with her suffering. Every petition she made for better treatment, every time she asked about her children, was reframed as arrogance. They called her the widow caped now, stripping her of not only her crown, but her name. She wasn't a queen, a wife, or a mother anymore, not in their eyes. She was simply an enemy of the state, a relic of a world they wanted to bury forever. Even acts of compassion from strangers were treated as crimes. When a jailer gave her extra bread or allowed her a moment of kindness, they were reprimanded or replaced. Nothing that offered her even a sliver of dignity was permitted. Still, she clung to the fragile hope that there might be justice, or at least a trial where she could defend herself. But as weeks in the conciergerie turned to months, it became clear that the trial was a mere formality. Her fate had already been decided. The revolutionary government wanted Marie Antoinette dead, not because of any specific crime, but because of what she represented. She was the old regime, the foreign queen, the scapegoat onto which the people could heap their frustrations. And when they finally brought her to trial in October of 1793, the accusations were violent in nature and often absurd, designed less to prove guilt and more to humiliate. Her time in the conciergerie wasn't just imprisonment. It was a methodical dismantling of a human being. Days bled into nights, each hour a new test of her endurance. Her cell was more than four walls and a locked door. It was a reflection of the world's rejection of her. The grandeur and opulence of Versailles felt like a distant memory, something that might have happened to someone else entirely. The concubine of luxury had been turned into a symbol of despair, her body and mind weighed down by everything she had lost. But even in this dark, airless world, glimpses of Marie Antoinette's former resilience shone through. Stories circulated among guards about the quiet grace she displayed despite her circumstances. She refused to beg for mercy, even when it became clear there would be none. And when she walked to her trial, pale and haggard, but holding her head high, the whispers spread. The queen they had destroyed still had a spark of defiance left. Even the revolution's cruelty hadn't extinguished it completely. The conciergerie wasn't just a place where Marie Antoinette waited for death. It was the place where she became a symbol, both despised and in some corners pitied. Her imprisonment was meant to crush her, to erase her spirit, but it also created a strange kind of legacy. When she finally left her cell, dragged toward her trial, spectators lined the streets, jeering and throwing insults. But perhaps, deep in their own hearts, even the coldest onlooker could see not just a broken queen, but a broken woman, struggling with the same human grief anyone else would bear. With every day in that cell, the roles she had carried throughout her life were stripped away one by one. First, a queen, then a mother, then, simply, Marie Antoinette. And by the time the guards led her through the gates for her trial, she'd become something else, a warning, a scapegoat, a sacrifice to the demanding tide of revolution. Her cell may have been left behind, but the damage it wrought never left her. In her expression, in her walk, in her silence, every inch of her carried the weight of those suffocating walls. And what came next would test her in ways even the solitude of confinement could not. Imagine standing in a courtroom, accused of crimes so vile, so grotesque, they leave you speechless. Now, imagine knowing that these accusations have nothing to do with justice. They exist only to humiliate you, to strip you of every last shred of dignity, and ultimately, to ensure your death. That's where Marie Antoinette stood in October of 1793, facing a trial as twisted as the revolution that had brought her there. But the charges against her didn't just target her as a queen. They were designed to annihilate her as a mother, a woman, and a human being. The trial came months after her imprisonment in the conciergerie, where she had already endured the near-total erosion of her former identity. By this point, she had lost her crown, her husband, 2 of her children, and arguably her health. But the public wasn't finished with Marie Antoinette. They wanted a spectacle, a grand finale to the years of hatred and blame that had been heaped on her shoulders. And what better way to ensure her complete ruin than with accusations so shocking they couldn't be ignored? The list of charges against her included all the usual revolutionary rhetoric: conspiring with foreign powers, draining the national treasury, and plotting against the Republic. But then things took a darker, more insidious turn. Among the many fabricated crimes was an accusation that Marie Antoinette had engaged in incest with her own son, Louis Charles. The boy, now a sickly and broken 9-year-old, had been taken from her months earlier and kept in isolation, subjected to both physical neglect and mental manipulation. His jailers had been working to turn him into a pawn in the revolution's vendetta against his family. Under duress, Louis Charles supposedly signed a statement accusing his mother of abusing him, a document that became a central piece of evidence in her trial. The boy himself never spoke in court, but his coerced words were enough. The blow landed exactly as intended. The shock of the accusation rippled across the courtroom, where even the most hardened revolutionary supporters seemed momentarily stunned. Incest. It wasn't just an accusation of immorality. It was an accusation designed to dehumanize, to poison the public's perception of her beyond repair. Marie Antoinette, who had already lost so much, stood there accused of betraying the very role that had once defined her, motherhood. And yet, amidst the chaos and the venom, she managed to respond. "If I have not replied," she said, "it is because nature itself refuses to respond to such a charge." Then, her voice firm as she addressed her accusers directly, she added, "I appeal to all mothers here." It's hard to imagine the strength it took to deliver that statement with any measure of composure. From the beginning, this trial was never about justice. It was about humiliation. The public craved vengeance, and Marie Antoinette had been painted as the perfect target for their rage. But even for those who had spent years jeering at her name, the accusation of incest may have seemed like too far of a leap. Still, the revolutionaries knew what they were doing. The trial was theatre in its cruelest form, ensuring that Marie Antoinette's reputation would die long before her body did. The evidence brought against her showed just how hollow the proceedings truly were. She was accused of exchanging secret letters with foreign powers, funneling money to Austria in a massive betrayal of France, and even sending coded messages right under the noses of her captors. But the so-called evidence, much of it was circumstantial, exaggerated, or outright fabricated. Pamphlets and hearsay were treated as fact, while thoroughly debunked stories were presented as proof of her treachery. One witness claimed she had conspired with her husband, Louis XVI, to undermine the revolution. This, despite the fact that Louis had long been dead by the time several of these alleged conspiracies were said to have occurred. Perhaps the most absurd part of the trial came when prosecutors referenced small, personal actions as signs of her guilt. They twisted everything about her into ammunition. Her extravagant hairstyles, proof of waste and indifference, her refurbishing of the Petit Trianon, evidence of greed. Even her attachment to Austrian customs and correspondences with her family were framed as dangerous betrayals. They combed through nearly every moment of her life, desperately looking for something damning, anything. At times, the judges seemed less concerned with establishing the truth, and more preoccupied with entertaining the crowd. And what a crowd it was. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with people eager for a closer look at their disgraced queen. For many, this wasn't about politics or justice. It was about spectacle. There she was, the woman they had written about in those scathing pamphlets. The queen they had mocked in cartoons for years, now no longer wrapped in her silks and jewels, but pale, worn, and visibly aged. They came to sneer. They came to gawk. They came to watch her fall. Throughout it all, Marie Antoinette sat stoic, her face betraying little of the anguish she surely felt. Her silence wasn't just about dignity. It was a survival strategy. Any word she spoke was twisted, taken out of context, and used as further evidence of her supposed arrogance or guilt. So for much of the trial, she sat quietly, listening, as the revolutionaries dismantled her life piece by piece. This wasn't a debate or even a defense of the charges against her. It was a predetermined conclusion, thinly disguised as legal proceedings. The testimony against her was riddled with contradictions, but that hardly mattered. The trial was a farce, its outcome already decided before she ever set foot in the courtroom. France didn't want Marie Antoinette's side of the story. They wanted her head. Each accusation, no matter how far-fetched, was one more drop of poison in a well that had been tainted years before. The question wasn't whether she was guilty. It was how loudly the revolution could vilify her on the way to the guillotine. By the end of the proceedings, there was no doubt where this was heading. Marie was found guilty on all charges: treason, conspiracy, incest. Her punishment was death by guillotine, the same fate that had met her husband months earlier. But as she sat in her cell awaiting the inevitable, the world around her remained just as deafening. Outside, people cheered the verdict, their hunger for vengeance finally satisfied. For them, this moment wasn't about a human being. It was about finishing what the revolution had started. Even so, parts of Marie's trial reveal fleeting moments of humanity, though perhaps not where you'd expect them. There were spectators who reportedly recognized how broken she looked and pitied her, despite everything the propaganda had conditioned them to believe. A mother mourning her son, a woman betrayed by her own country. These thoughts may not have been voiced aloud in such a charged setting, but perhaps they lingered quietly amid the chaos. The revolutionaries aimed to obliterate every part of her identity, and yet, even at her lowest, Marie managed to hold on to fragments of who she was. Her composure in court, particularly after such vile accusations, offered at least a glimpse of her dignity, even if stripped of its earlier grandeur. She couldn't win, but she could refuse to be reduced to the monster they painted her to be. Whatever cruelties they unleashed, she faced them silently, perhaps knowing that her truth had already been buried in the noise. The trial wasn't a search for answers. It was an assault disguised as justice. It was an attempt to destroy what little of Marie Antoinette remained, her legacy, her honor, and her voice. And yet, when the accusations brought shame and disbelief, her call to all mothers here echoed as perhaps her final defiant stand. Even those who wanted to hate her couldn't ignore the raw humanity behind her words. That moment, though brief, meant something. When the court finally closed its proceedings and handed down her sentence, there was no gasp, no shock. Everyone present had expected it. This trial was never about verdicts. It was about vengeance, about making an example of a queen whose name had been on every tongue for years. And as the crowd spilled into the streets that day, the focus turned from her guilt to the much-anticipated spectacle of her final walk to the guillotine. The stage was set for her final humiliation. Every layer of her life had been ripped apart, piece by piece, until all that was left was a woman staring down her own mortality. But even as the revolutionaries paraded their victory in the coming days, one truth quietly lingered. No trial could fully bury the legacy of a woman who had, for better or worse, symbolized an entire era. And as her final moments drew near, everything that had been done to her would come into sharp focus, not just as a fall from grace, but as a reflection of the time she lived in. Marie Antoinette's final days at the Conciergerie were as bleak as you might expect. By this point, the walls of her cell were stained with dampness, her bed little more than straw and rough fabric. Months of confinement had worn her down more than years in the palace ever could. Her once pale complexion was now hollow and grey, her hair almost entirely white from the stress of imprisonment. She spent her final nights under the constant watch of guards stationed directly in her cell, who allowed her no privacy, not even as a final kindness. She was no longer a queen, not even a political enemy. She had become a body waiting for its death sentence to be carried out. On the morning of October 16, 1793, she rose to face her final walk. They dressed her in a simple white linen gown, the kind a common widow might wear. Nothing marked her as the queen she once was. Her hands were tightly bound behind her back, iron shackles digging into her wrists as she was led to the courtyard. She was placed on a wooden cart covered in filth and straw, a far cry from the gilded carriages that used to whisk her through the streets in regal splendor. Beside her sat the executioner, silent, unmoved. It was time. The journey from the Conciergerie to the Place de la Révolution was just over 2 miles, a route that snaked through the crowded streets of Paris. Those streets had seen her many times before, years ago, when she was still young, when the people gathered to glimpse their queen in silk and jewels. Now the same people lined the route, but not to cheer. They came to jeer, to mock, to catch one last look at the woman who had become their scapegoat. As the cart rolled forward, the crowd swarmed closer, shouting insults, spitting, waving crudely drawn pamphlets that depicted her as greedy, manipulative and cruel. Some threw rotten vegetables, others simply stared, fascinated. Marie sat upright, her head held high despite the noise and humiliation around her. Not once did she shout back or flinch at the taunts. She didn't beg for mercy or ask for forgiveness. She simply endured it in silence. That silence must have carried more weight than any words she could have said. It wasn't submission. It was defiance, though not the kind that stoked anger. It was a quiet refusal to let the crowd see her break. As the wooden wheels rattled over the cobblestones, the physical discomfort of the ride became clear. It was cold, the autumn air biting against her skin, and the rough passage jolted her uncomfortably with every bump. Her hands remained bound, forcing her body into an awkward, stiff posture. But she didn't fidget, didn't allow herself to look weak. Even when the crowd's shouts grew more obscene, she kept her gaze steady, occasionally glancing upward, her eyes finding nothing but the grey sky above. Maybe she was praying. Maybe, in those moments, she was thinking of her children, or even of the peaceful gardens at Versailles. Whatever the case, she didn't let the crowd see whatever emotions swirled within. The route was carefully chosen for maximum spectacle. They paraded her through some of the most bustling areas of Paris, so as many citizens as possible could see the fallen queen. Once a symbol of grandeur, now a prisoner on her way to death. At certain points, the cart moved at a near crawl, not because of the executioner's pace, but because people clogged the streets ahead to get a better look. There were cheers, whistles. A few people handed out makeshift pamphlets with exaggerated drawings of her final moments. Those who got too close to the cart were sometimes pushed back roughly by guards, though they too seemed to relish the unusual sight of a royal brought low. The Place de la Révolution, formerly known as the Place Louis XV, came into view after what must have felt like an eternity. The square, vast and open, was filled with an enormous crowd. Thousands of people stood shoulder to shoulder, craning their necks to see the platform at the center. At the edge of the square, the guillotine stood waiting, its sharp, gleaming blade catching what little light the overcast sky provided. The sheer size of the apparatus struck even seasoned attendees of executions as monstrous. As the cart creaked to a stop, Marie Antoinette stepped down with as much grace as her bound wrists and stiff joints allowed. Her bound hands almost forced her to stumble, but she righted herself quickly, straightening her back. The guards wasted no time. They escorted her up the platform stairs, making a spectacle of each step to ensure the crowd saw her climb. The shouts continued, louder now, echoing off the nearby buildings. Some mocked her height, once aggrandized by her towering hairstyles, now diminished without powdered wigs or ornate gowns. Others yelled crude things about her family, her children, even her husband's death, but she didn't meet their eyes. She kept her gaze ahead, on the executioner, on the guillotine, on the end of her journey. On the scaffold, there was no speech, no final proclamation. Instead, Marie stepped forward to quietly accept her fate. Historians recount one moment that almost feels cinematic. As she moved toward the guillotine, she accidentally stepped on the foot of the executioner. In what may have been one of her very last acts, she turned to him and apologized. "Pardon me, monsieur," she said. "I did not do it on purpose." It's such a small thing, almost unremarkable, but it speaks volumes. A moment of courtesy, of humanity, even as she stood at the edge of oblivion. The executioner guided her to the base of the guillotine and secured her to the plank. Her hands, still bound, were tightened further as her head was placed into the lunette, the wooden brace designed to hold her neck in place. Her hair, now cropped short and white, was pushed aside to allow for a clean cut. The platform was silent except for the faint murmur of the crowd. Even the loudest voices seemed to quiet in those final moments, whether out of respect, fear, or anticipation. Less than 60 seconds later, it was over. The blade fell with the precision that had made the guillotine infamous during the Revolution. The executioner lifted her head for the crowd to see, as was custom. Some cheered, some stood stunned. Others, perhaps for the first time, saw not a queen or a symbol, but simply a woman, a mother, a widow, a person, whose life had been taken in the name of change. The silence that followed felt heavier than the noise that had preceded it. Marie Antoinette's body, like her husband's before her, was taken away unceremoniously. She was buried in an unmarked grave, her remains left to decay alongside those of so many others who had met similar fates during the Revolution. For years afterward, the site of that grave would remain unmarked, her life erased as thoroughly as her crown had been. It wasn't until decades later that her body was exhumed and reburied at the Basilica of Saint-Denis, where French royalty traditionally lay. By the end of that cold October day, the crowds in the square had dispersed, the streets emptying as the spectacle concluded. But what remained was a kind of question, a lingering weight left by the image of a woman who had once symbolized power, brought to her knees by the sheer force of public anger and fear. Her final moments weren't about grandeur or defiance. They were about quiet resilience, about holding together even as everything she had ever been was stripped away. History would debate her legacy for generations to come. But in that moment, her story ended not with a bang, but with a silence far louder than the jeering ever could be. It's easy, in hindsight, to view her as a figure defined by tragedy. She was the outsider queen, who was never quite trusted, the symbol of a monarchy crumbling under its own weight. Her name became shorthand for excess, greed, and ignorance. But strip away the caricature, and you're left with something deeply human. A woman waiting to die, still saying, "Pardon me," as she stepped toward the end. Her death may have symbolized the end of an era, but her life remains a haunting reminder of just how fragile humanity becomes when caught in the tide of revolution. A quiet ending to a loud, unrelenting story. Marie Antoinette's life wasn't a tale of decadence. It was a series of burdens, each one heavier than the last. A teenage bride turned queen of a collapsing monarchy. Her story became a myth whispered louder than the reality it erased. History loves its villains, but sometimes it forgets its humans. So as you let your eyes close tonight, consider the weight of a crown, the isolation of a prison cell, or the loss that breaks a mother. The world is filled with shadows like hers, quiet stories overlooked, misunderstood, and waiting. What other lives lie hidden just out of reach?